Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is No Game, No Life, Episode 5, Week Square. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary of what happens within this episode. So this episode starts with Tet at his home being confronted by the old Deuce for interfering in humanity's coronation of their new kings, as they had detected the event that brought Sora and Shiro into Disboard, the world of Disboard, and they want to know whether or not that means that Tet is going to enter the fight, as he had traditionally been neutral, which is why he managed to win the title of One True God by default, because he was the only god who didn't participate in the war that almost destroyed the world. But he basically says that he's on no one's side before saying that they're coming for them all the way to the top, implying, of course, the conversation from the previous episode where Sora and Shiro have decided to conquer the world and earn the right to challenge Tet again to another game of chess once they have all of the race pieces to make up their side of the chessboard. We then move back to Elkia, where Steph has essentially been given most of the administrative work for the kingdom, while Sora and Shiro basically play games and read a lot. And she's getting tired of having to do all the work, so she goes to find them, and we find out that they've given up sleeping in the royal chambers because the bed is slightly tilted, and have instead taken up residence in the basement, sleeping on some straw, and are following their neat schedule. And basically, when Steph accuses them of being lazy, they basically say that, no one's ever going to make Kuhaku actually have to work for a living. It's not going to happen for them. They play games. That's what they do. And Steph, as mentioned, was annoyed, so she decides to challenge Sora to a game, and if she wins, he has to be a decent person, which, as we know from her having to fall in love with Sora, the commandments can make those kinds of changes. They are that absolute. So Sora decides to change it to, if he wins, she'll make him popular, and is very excited to play, except Shiro then says that he can't throw the game, which makes him depressed because he believes there's absolutely no way that Steph will ever be able to beat him at a game, and becomes depressed. They play blackjack. She loses, and they then decide to continue. And then they find out that Steph is basically everything they hate in a person. She has connections to all of the nobles. She graduated top of her class. She's politically savvy. She's wealthy. She's a princess. And this pisses them off. So because they didn't set a condition on the blackjack game, they decide to make her be their dog for the day. And then they go into town. When they get into town, they notice everyone's looking at them strangely. And that's when Steph reveals that they've dressed her like a werebeast with the dog ears and the tail. And this, of course, makes Sora excited because now he knows that werebeasts are basically people who have animal ears and tails, which he, of course, turns into a fantasy of them all being girls, though Steph is quick to point out that there are elders and male werebeasts as well. It's not just girls with animal ears and tails, but Sora kind of ignores her. And she continues to challenge him throughout the day as they wander around the town. And every time she loses a challenge, she loses a piece of clothing. And that continues throughout the entire day until we get to the end of the day when Sora and Shiro are in despair because they have looked at every book that is in the palace and haven't been able to find enough information. And they explain to Steph how games are won before they even begin, and the way that they are won is by having superior knowledge before they begin in order to change the odds and in order to challenge, for example, the werebeasts. They need to have knowledge of the werebeasts, but there's no libraries or bookstores, and none of the books in the palace had the information that they needed. And then finally it comes to the point where Steph then reveals that there used to be a library, but a flugel had challenged the previous king, her grandfather, who ended up losing the library in a bet, and that gives Sora and Shiro hope. So they head to the library after witnessing the phantasma, which is Evenheim, which the flugel live on top of. And we end the episode with them entering the library to see the dramatic entrance of a flugel that is then ruined by the fact that she speaks in a very interesting way. And that's what happens in this episode. So it's now time to rank the episode. As always, we rank on two ranking lists, our mostly objective ranking list, and then the personal ranking list. So we start with our mostly objective rank values, and I highlighted those I felt applied to the episode. On our first positive side, we basically have that there was some world building in this episode because they did enter the lower town. They saw the way that the citizens were living. For example, they learned that goods like sugar, because of how small the territory has become, is not there. So when they try to eat donuts, for example, they don't taste very good. You know, it shows scenes of the citizens, how they're afraid of Stephanie when she's dressed with the dog ears and tail because they are afraid of werebeasts who have taken most of their current territory. We see kind of how, well, they're talking about the state of the humanity. They show little flashes on screen of people in poverty, of very sad looking vegetables at a stall, and there not being very many of them, implying, of course, that there are food shortages. And this then implies that Stephanie did a very good job of keeping things together with the limited resources that they have, but that obviously something needs to be done soon, or, you know, things will end up kind of a bit in despair. But again, this is what leads to that conversation about how a game is won before it begins, and in order to win the game, you need to have knowledge of the game, and that is what Sora and Shiro are currently lacking. And that was worth 4 points. However, this episode also had a negative 4 points, which was that there was no real main plot significance. It was a filler episode. Basically, the majority of the episode was taken up with Steph acting a fool and Steph challenging Sora and Shiro to multiple games that she continually kept losing, believing that she was challenging them to games of chance. However, it is later revealed by Sora and Shiro's explanation that, again, there is no game of chance. It's based on knowledge, and the person with the most knowledge is the one who will win. And that was basically the purpose of this episode, to teach that lesson. But other than them wandering around town and Steph progressively losing clothing as she continually loses games, that's pretty much all that happened. Which basically those make it a 0 out of 10 episode. However, the lowest score that's allowed on the channel is a 1, so this makes it a 1 out of 10 officially. And with that, we come to our series ranking so far for the mostly objective ranking. And in first place, we had beginner, grandmaster, challenger, expert, and then this episode comes in fifth, weak square. Bringing us now to the personal ranking, which I was a little more generous because there were some comedic moments. For example, when Steph goes to wake them up, she pulls out off the curtain and they basically roll around comedically saying that their eyes are burning. They have that line about how, you know, no one can make them work, and then behind them big letters NEET show up, which of course stands for not in education, employment, or training. And then there's also when they're dealing with the nobles, they basically strip the nobles of their titles, and Steph reveals that in the background she's been working to peacefully transition power by winning over the nobles, and these were the last three she had to win over, but now they've been basically made fools of because they lost to Sora and Shiro, and they lost their titles, land, businesses, clothing, everything to them. And then that's when they find out that Steph was popular in the past and may not actually be as well, they did not think very highly of her, let's just say it that way, to the point where they even kind of made her name a derogatory term to stand for somebody who is not quite there. And that also is quite funny because it's so shocking to them that they fall out of their chairs. So it had some comedic moments. However, like I said, it mostly was them wandering through town, Steph challenging them to games that she then lost, and them basically taking her clothing, which, so here's the thing about anime. I love anime for its comedy, for its storytelling, for a lot of its concepts, but the one thing I can never get behind, but you gotta take the bad with the good, is the perversion that just seems to run through most anime. It is extremely rare to find an anime that does not have perverted characters or that does not put in what they would consider fan service, although they only ever target men typically with the fan service. They don't really make it equal and target the women with the fan service. It always seems to be the male side. They have a really big thing about harems that they love to put in. So, in general, anime tends to be extremely perverted. And as someone who is a bit more prudish in nature, I never really like that. But like I said, the good things about anime often overshadow the negatives. However, this episode was extremely heavy with the perversion. There was the nobles basically losing everything, including their clothing, and then Steph's punishments being acting like a dog, which could be a kink. And then, of course, every time she loses the game, having to give up a piece of her clothing until, like, by the end, she's practically wearing nothing. And they at least keep it PG in that she is wearing something, but it does go there, and that isn't fun for me personally, which is why it brought down the ranking of the episode. But again, it did have the fun comedic moments, and so I decided it was a 3 out of 10, a little more generous than the objective ranking. But that still put this episode in 5th place on the personal ranking. And as a reminder of where the other episodes fell, in first place we had Grandmaster, then Beginner, Expert, Challenger, and then this one was Weak Square. With that, we've now rewatched and ranked No Game No Life episode 5, Weak Square. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.